In the mid-1800s, China suffered from a lot of problems, including overpopulation and wars. 20 million people were killed during the Taiping Rebellion in Guangxi Province from 1851 to 1864. The Second Opium War with the British from 1856 to 1860 caused a lot of suffering. 90% of the immigrants from Guangdong Province were formerly prosperous, but lost a lot during the trade wars. California experienced a surge in Chinese immigration in 1852. They were attracted by the gold rush. Most left their families back home. They expected to work in the United States for a few years and then go home again. Entry into the U.S. in the 1850s was relatively uncomplicated because immigration into the United States was generally free and unrestricted. America welcomed immigrants from around the world to settle the land and provide the labor for its newly industrialized economy. In California, the Chinese claimed exhausted mine claims. Using cooperative strategies of families working together, good water management, and patience, they made the mines that others had abandoned pay out. By the 1870s, 25% of all miners in California were Chinese. In the 1860s, many Chinese found jobs working on the railroads, most famously working on the Central Pacific side of the first transcontinental railroad. Although the U.S. government officially encouraged the immigration of Chinese laborers, they encountered fierce racial animosity. Employers liked Mexicans and Chinese workers because they were cheap. During the 1870s, massive population growth, coupled with economic dislocation in California, helped fan the fires of early anti-Chinese sentiment. By 1870, historians estimate, there were 4 workers for every job. But Chinese laborers were producing 50% of California's boots and shoes. By 1882, Chinese made up between 50 to 75% of the farm labor in some California counties. Blaming Chinese workers for low wages and the scarcity of jobs, anti-Chinese leaders first charged that the Chinese were imported under servile conditions and were engaged in a new system of slavery that degraded American labor. The Foreign Miners Act was an act passed by the state of California in 1850, imposing a tax of $20 a month on foreign miners. The act raised much less revenue than expected, primarily because a lot of Mexican and Chinese miners quit mining in response to the act. While both Mexican and Chinese miners quit in large numbers and many mining camps depopulated, the effect on their presence in the country was different. Many Mexicans returned home to Mexico, whereas Chinese mostly moved to the cities in an impoverished state, further increasing resentment felt by whites towards the Chinese. Landowners and merchants near mines were concerned about the drop in rents and prices and the decrease in demand in their region due to the exodus of the miners. They lobbied for the repeal of the tax. The Foreign Miners Tax Act was repealed in 1851 and subsequently replaced by the Foreign Miners License Tax Act of 1852, which charged just $3 a month. People v. Hall was an appeal from a murder case in the 1850s. In that case, the California Supreme Court ruled that Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants had no right to testify against white citizens. The Federal Page Act of 1875 banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. This was the first law passed to prevent members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating into the U.S. The Angel Treaty of 1880, which was a set of revisions to the U.S.-China Burlingame Treaty of 1868, allowed the U.S. to suspend all Chinese immigration. Colorado initially encouraged Chinese immigration and then tried to discourage it. In 1880, non-Asians began a riot in Denver's Chinatown, causing over $53,655 in property damage and killing 1 man. There were no convictions and no compensation for damages. Some Chinese left town, but the Chinese population continued to increase in Colorado until the early 20th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. and becoming citizens. This act provided an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act required non-laborers, such as merchants, teachers, students, diplomats, and travelers, who were exempt from exclusion, to obtain certification from the Chinese government that they were qualified to immigrate. But this group found it increasingly difficult to prove that they were not laborers. under the Act. Thus, very few Chinese could enter the country under the 1882 law. The 1882 Exclusion Act also placed new requirements on Chinese who had already entered the country. If they left the United States, they had to obtain certifications to re-enter. Congress, moreover, refused state and federal courts the right to grant citizenship to Chinese resident aliens. The Chinese Exclusion Act set another precedent by defining illegal immigration as a criminal offense. Defining and punishing illegal immigrants directly led to the establishment of the country's first modern deportation laws as well. Chinese immigration dropped dramatically. In 1882, before the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect, 39,579 Chinese rushed to enter the United States. Thereafter, the numbers fell to an all-time low in 1887, when immigration officials admitted only 10 Chinese immigrants into the United States. The 1882 Exclusion Act was extended by the Geary Act of 1892 and repealed by the Magnuson Act of 1943, which allowed 105 Chinese to enter per year. Chinese immigration later increased with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which abolished direct racial barriers, and later by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which abolished the national origins formula. The Chinese Exclusion Act was followed by a period in which anti-Chinese sought to physically force the Chinese out. It ushered in the most violent decade in Chinese American history, with assault, arson, and murder becoming ever-present dangers for a people marginalized in the eyes of the law. Many of these outbreaks occurred in western states. The Rock Springs Chinese Massacre of 1885 and the Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887 were two notable events in history. Starting with the Denver Riot, there were 153 major violent acts against Chinese between 1852 and 1908. 91 of those acts occurred in the 1880s. The Rock Springs Massacre occurred in 1885. Many enraged white miners in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, felt threatened by the Chinese and blamed them for their unemployment. As a result of the job competition, white miners expressed their frustration in physical violence, where they robbed, shot, and stabbed at Chinese in Chinatown. The Chinese tried to flee, but in doing so, many ended up being burnt alive in their homes, starved to death in a hidden refuge, or exposed to animal predators in the mountains. Some were successfully rescued by a passing train, but by the end of the event, at least 28 lives had been lost. The government intervened by sending federal troops to protect the Chinese. However, following the event, the only compensation given was for destroyed property. No one was arrested nor held accountable. In the Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887, a gang of 7 white men robbed, murdered, and mutilated between 10 to 34 Chinese employees of the Sam Yep Company, one of the 6 largest Chinese companies at the time, which had worked in this area since 1886. Gold worth between $4,000 and $5,000 was estimated to have been stolen from the miners. The Sam Yep Company of San Francisco hired Lee Loy who later hired Joseph K. Vincent to lead an investigation. Vincent submitted his report to the Chinese consulate, who tried unsuccessfully to obtain justice for the Chinese miners. On October 19, 1888, Congress agreed to compensate for the massacre. It was a small victory to the Chinese, who had low expectations of relief or acknowledgement. Expelled from mining camps, excluded from industrial and agricultural labor, Chinese men established an economic niche for themselves in laundries, restaurants, and domestic service. They found refuge in Chinatowns, insular worlds that provided a sense of security and the companionship of kinsmen. But they clung to American life and values and fought for their rights using the tools of the courts, recognizing that the U.S. Constitution offered protection to all people in America, not merely its citizens. The Chinese boldly filed over 10,000 lawsuits challenging laws and practices designed to harass and oppress them. On May 10, 1886, Yick won a Supreme Court case that ensured that all people, citizens and non-citizens, had equal protection under the law. Yick and Wo, Chinese immigrants, ran laundries in San Francisco. In 1880, San Francisco passed a law requiring a permit for laundries housed in wooden buildings, as they were more vulnerable to fires. Of the 320 laundries in San Francisco, 310 were in wooden buildings, and most of them, 240, were owned by Chinese. Not one Chinese laundry applicant was issued a permit. The Supreme Court ruled that the Chinese had to be treated equally and given an equal opportunity to obtain a laundry permit. On March 28, 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in United States v. Wong Kim Ark, holding that children born in the United States, even to parents not eligible to become citizens, were nonetheless United States citizens themselves under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873 to Chinese immigrant parents. In 1890, they moved back to China, and Wong went to visit them later that year. He was allowed to re-enter the United States upon his return on the grounds he was born in the United States and was a citizen. However, a few years later, in 1895, Wong Kim Ark went on another visit to China. When he returned to the U.S., he was denied entry into San Francisco on the grounds that he was not a U.S. citizen. Under the Naturalization Act of 1790, only free white persons of good moral character were allowed to become citizens. The Naturalization Act of 1870 had extended this right to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. But Congress had specifically left out Chinese and other non-white minorities. Moreover, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 forbade Chinese from entering the U.S. as immigrants and from becoming naturalized U.S. citizens. Prior to this case, birthplace was not thought to be enough to constitute citizenship. In fact, many places in the world at that time still held that the citizenship of the father decided the citizenship of the child. The Supreme Court's decision acknowledged that the 14th Amendment had added citizenship by place of birth to citizenship inherited from a father. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and subsequent fire burned most of the immigration records and provided a crack in the wall of exclusion that the Chinese could use to bring others from China to America. With no records available, the Chinese already living in the U.S. could claim to have been born here, making themselves citizens. As such, they were entitled to bring their children from China.